I love a good horror film, and sometimes I like to go back and rewatch some of the old classics. And recently, I found myself watching the 1960 horror classic Black Sunday, starring Barbara Steele. The opening scene is beautifully shot in black and white, and I found myself glued to the scene as a witch was being ceremoniously put to death. It was a brutal representation of what the witch trials were like back in the day. Black Sunday definitely left me wanting to know more about witches and witch trials throughout history, and I found myself deep diving down a rabbit hole of research. Welcome to the Poison Culture Podcast, where people of interest start our news. I'm your host, Cody Gregory. Perhaps the majority of us have heard about the Salem witch trials, one of the most infamous events to happen in American history. Between February 1692 and May 1693, over 200 people were accused of witchcraft. 30 people were found guilty. 14 women and 5 men were executed by hanging. And one other man was pressed to death, a form of torture in which the subject is pressed beneath an increasingly heavy load of stones in an attempt to make him enter a plea. The Salem witch trials were definitely a dark chapter in American history, but they also offer a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of mass hysteria and persecution. To understand how the witch trials began, we must go back in time to the 17th century. At this time, the Puritan colonists who had settled in the Massachusetts area were deeply religious and devoutly believed in the power of the supernatural. They advocated for greater purity of worship and doctrine, and they had come to believe that the devil was real and actively working to corrupt people's souls. This belief was reinforced by a series of disasters that had recently befallen Salem, including crop failures, disease outbreaks, and conflicts with Native Americans. As it's recorded, in early 1692, a group of young girls in Salem began experiencing strange fits and symptoms, including convulsions, hallucinations, and temporary paralysis. The girls' behavior was initially dismissed as mere childishness, but when their symptoms persisted, people began to suspect that they were under the influence of witchcraft. It wasn't long before the girls eventually began accusing people in the community of bewitching them, and the accusations quickly spread. Of course, the targets of the accusations were typically people who were already marginalized in some way, either because they were poor or because they were seen as different or unusual. Most of the accused were women, although some men were also targeted. Overall, the Puritan belief in prevailing New England culture was that women were inherently sinful and more susceptible to damnation than men were. Throughout their daily lives, Puritans, especially Puritan women, actively attempted to thwart attempts by the devil to overtake them and their souls. Indeed, Puritans held the belief that men and women were equal in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the devil. If you can believe this, women's souls were seen as unprotected in their weak and vulnerable bodies. Several factors may explain why women were more likely to admit guilt of witchcraft than men. Historian Elizabeth Reese asserts that some likely believed that they had truly given in to the devil, and others might have believed that they had done so temporarily. However, because those who confessed had a chance to be reintegrated into society, some women might have confessed in order to spare their own lives. People who were accused of witchcraft were often subjected to brutal interrogations and torture, during which they were forced to confess to being in league with the devil. Some of the common methods of torture included the use of the rack, a device consisting of a rectangular, usually wooden frame, slightly raised from the ground, with a roller at one or both ends. The victim's ankles are fastened to one roller and the wrists are chained to the other. As the interrogation progresses, a handle and a ratchet mechanism attached to the top roller are used to very gradually retract the chains, slowly increasing the strain on the prisoner's shoulders, hips, knees, and elbows, and causing excruciating pain. The strappado was also used, which is the victim's hands are tied behind their back and the victim is suspended by a rope attached to the wrists, typically resulting in dislocated shoulders. Weights were sometimes added to the body to intensify the effects and increase the pain. And you can't forget about the thumb screw, which is a simple vise, sometimes with protruding studs on the interior surfaces. The crushing bars were sometimes lined with sharp metal points to puncture the nails. Most often than not, those who refused to confess to witchcraft were usually executed. Either way, once an accusation was made against a person, their lives changed for the worst in an instant. And as we all know by the lore, the most common method of execution for those convicted of witchcraft was burning at the stake. This was seen as a particularly appropriate punishment for witches, because fire was believed to be a purifying element that could cleanse the soul of evil. Other common methods of execution included hanging and drowning. One form of judgment was to take an accused witch and drown her. When they brought the body up, if it was still alive, then it was for sure a witch. But if it was dead, then they were probably innocent. In some cases, convicted witches were subjected to public humiliation, such as being paraded through the streets and forced to wear a sign indicating their crime. They might also be stripped and examined for witches' marks, which were believed to be the signs of the devil's influence on the body. It is without doubt that the people of Salem were driven to hysteria by their religious extremism and their beliefs in the supernatural and the fear of the devil. They were so convinced that witchcraft was real and that they were willing to accuse and execute innocent people based on flimsy evidence. The witch trials quickly spiraled out of control. Accusations were made against prominent members of the community, including the wife of the governor. The trials also became a way for people to settle old scores and grudges, with many people using the accusations to target their enemies. The witch trials also highlighted the importance of due process and the rule of law. During the trials, the accused were often denied the right to a fair trial, and many were subjected to brutal interrogations and forced confessions. This lack of due process meant that innocent people were often convicted and executed. The Salem witch trials were a tragic and dark chapter in American history. They remind us of the dangers of mass hysteria, persecution, and intolerance. The witch trials, in a way, came to an end in May of 1693, when the governor of Massachusetts declared that the spectral evidence, which is the evidence based on the supposed testimony of ghosts or spirits, was inadmissible in court. With this ruling, the accusations against the accused witches lost their legal basis, and the trials gradually came to a close. But how did anyone in the first place know how to accuse someone of being a witch? The Malleus Maleficarum, also known as the Hammer of the Witches, was a book on witchcraft written in 1486 by Heinrich Kramer, a German Catholic clergyman and inquisitor. The book was intended to serve as a guide for identifying, prosecuting, and punishing witches, and it became one of the most influential texts on witchcraft during the witch hysteria that occurred in Europe and America in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Malleus Maleficarum argued that witchcraft was a real and serious threat to society, and it offered a detailed description of the various ways in which witches were believed to practice their craft. The book claimed that witches were in league with the devil, and that they engaged in a wide range of nefarious activities, including casting spells, causing sickness and death, and also engaging in sexual intercourse with demons. One of the most significant impacts of the Malleus Maleficarum was that it helped to fuel the witch hysteria that swept across Europe during the late Middle Ages and early modern period. The book was widely read and accepted as authoritative, and it provided a framework for identifying and prosecuting suspected witches. It gave the authorities the tools they needed to identify, interrogate, and punish those suspected of witchcraft. The book explicitly identifies women as the primary practitioners of witchcraft, and suggests that they are inherently more susceptible to the devil's temptations. As a result, women were often singled out and accused of witchcraft, even when there was little or no evidence to support the accusations. The Malleus Maleficarum helped to create a climate of fear and suspicion around witchcraft, which led to the widespread prosecution and execution of people suspected of practicing the craft. This had a profound impact on the lives of people during the witch hysteria, leading to the widespread persecution and loss of countless innocent lives. Although the last trial in Salem was held in May of 1693, public response to the events continued. In the decades following the trials, survivors and family members and their supporters sought to establish the innocence of the individuals who were convicted and to gain compensation. In the following centuries, the descendants of those unjustly accused and condemned have sought to honor their memories. The cause and symptoms of those who claimed affliction continues to be a subject of interest. Various medical and psychological explanations for the observed symptoms have been explored by researchers, including psychological hysteria in response to Indian attacks. Another theory is convulsive ergotism caused by eating rye bread made from grain infected with the fungus, a natural substance from which LSD is derived, although that claim has been widely debated. Some modern historians are less inclined to focus on the biological explanations, preferring instead to explore the motivations such as jealousy, spite, and need for attention to explain the behavior. Or perhaps, maybe there really was witchcraft happening in Salem, Massachusetts. It's just one of life's mysteries. We may never know what really happened during that time. Well, that's this episode of the Poison Culture Podcast. You can follow me on Instagram and YouTube at Poison Culture Podcast. Until next time, stay spooky.